We began last time by talking about the fears and anxieties surrounding the concept of vows. And the fear and anxiety mainly revolved around the perspective or prospect, I guess I should say, of losing freedom. Because we are agreeing to something in which our freedoms, we might feel like are being impinged upon. And especially when we talk about vows of monasticism, we might have the stereotypical sad monk in our vision of this guy that's been in this monastery for who knows how many years and is, praying every day and working in the monastery and living a generally dull life. That's probably what a lot of us have in our minds when we think about monastics. But the revival of monastic orders in the Anglican tradition in the 1800s was in fact exactly the opposite of this. The monastics of the newly revived orders of the 1800s, in fact, were a little bit of a reaction against the non-freedoms provided within the public arena and within their public culture. This is actually a really fascinating paradox, because when we think about monastics, we sometimes think about those who have lost their freedom. But the monastics and the monastic movement in the 1800s were those who actually gained freedom or believed that they gained freedom from certain cultural mores and cultural expectations of Victorian England. So when we think about monastics, especially as we think about the role of monasticism, we really do need to think a bit more carefully about what we mean by loss of freedom. And is that actually an anxiety that is appropriate for certain kinds of vows within the church? Well, taking into account both the allure of vows, the desire for vows, of a deeper relationship with God in a certain kind of vowed capacity, we need to counterbalance that with the fear and anxieties of what does it mean to lose myself into this thing, when in fact it might actually be the opposite that's happening. For various reasons, not simply for cultural freedom reasons, but really for the basic sort of freedom in Christ. In fact, the earliest monastics thought of themselves as doing so by, in a different way, rebelling against societal mores that they believed, and to be completely honest, they were right in a lot of ways, were corrupting the church itself. In fact, all the way back to the first Christian monastics of the Egyptian desert and the Arabian desert, we have the kind of staunch tradition of removal of oneself from society in order to more fully chase after freedom in Christ. Because when the early monastics began their movement, it coincided with the legalization of Christianity within the Roman Empire in the 200s and 300s. And when that happened, all of a sudden persecution ceased. And there were great monks such as Antony of Egypt who look around and say, we believe that if we're followers of Jesus, we will be persecuted for what we are doing. And we are now experiencing a period of non-persecution. And so the alarm bells began to ring for some of our early monastics. Well, fast forward nearly 1,800 years after that, 1,600 probably, and we're in a time period in England in which we are post-Reformation. We're in a time period in which England has come out of the religious wars, and likewise, England is still in jockeying position against other entities on the European continent for power within the kind of wider swath of the world. And almost all of those powers that England was in competition with were not simply vestigial, but were quite strong Roman Catholic proponents, such as France and Spain. And we need to take into consideration the fact that after England breaks away from the Roman Catholic Church in the 1500s in the Reformation, the challenge culturally of anti-Catholicism is still quite rampant within the English countryside. Anything that looked even slightly like what Roman Catholics did was not only frowned upon, but in some cases it was criminal to do so. There's famous examples in the 1800s, by the way, of priests who are members of the Oxford movement, which is the sort of re-engagement with ancient Catholicism in England, of them being put in jail for having candles on the altar. In fact, there is very famous in the Diocese of Arkansas, where we are right now, a reprimand of a previous dean of Trinity Cathedral in Little Rock for having candles on the altar by one of the bishops because of this anti-Catholic suspicion. And so you already see we have some cultural, religious things going on with that. However, there are also some important Victorian cultural things going on as well that largely are engendered. So the women of the Victorian era, and this is a broad brushstroke, this is largely the cultural understanding and the cultural sort of expression of Victorian England, but women of the household largely were involved with household chores and childbearing. And they were, in a lot of ways, kind of sequestered from society, with the exception being going to parties in order to gain marriage into a potentially good family. By the way, if you want an example of what a lot of this looks like in Victorian England, you can really simply go and either read or watch Pride and Prejudice, the famous novel that comes out about that time that describe a lot of these things. The reason why this is important is because monastic orders largely begin revival in the women's orders first. And when we see that revival, we're going to start seeing some of those cultural mores become, in some cases, entangled with society in ways that oppose the church's organizational structure. In other words, the very ways in which monastics and the revival of monastic life was in England at the time was countercultural in a significant fashion. And not just countercultural in that we're doing the things that the Roman Catholics seem to do. No, not just that. It's that the women who were part of these revival movements were in large part women who discovered freedom in the monastic movement. But that being said, let's take a look at what exactly these women, the women of the time were doing, what they were looking at, and how the legacy of the vows of monasticism echo even to where we are today. So the revival of monastic vows. How did this happen? Why did it happen? Well, in large part, the reason why this is important is because the Oxford movement of the 1800s, which is a significantly important movement, it's a significantly important academic movement. The Oxford movement is named because a lot of our brain trusts of the movement come from the College and University of Oxford. And these are largely headed up because of a renewed corpus of documents that have come into the general scholarly awareness of the early church in the patristic period. And the reason why this is important is because the early church in the patristic period, in other words, the period between probably about the 100s to 500s, was deeply influenced by the monastic movement. You could probably call it a rediscovery of monasticism. And I would call it a rediscovery because it's not that, it's not necessarily that the monastic movement in the 300s was the template in which most people thought about monasticism. Really, monasticism in England during the 1800s was the thing that the Roman Catholics do. And anytime that we pigeonhole a certain kind of movement into that's just what they do, we lose the roots of where it comes from. And like I just talked about, monasticism in the Christian, in really the widest Christian sort of observance, was a reaction against certain kinds of cultural forces that were going on in the Roman Empire at the time. And so rediscovery of monasticism happens in the Oxford movement. I just want to note that Oxford movement is going to be 1800s. Okay? This rediscovery of monasticism through the patristics is going to involve a couple of our Oxford movement people, but primarily it's going to involve a man named Pusey. Edward Pusey. And he is a priest in the Church of England. And in the mid-1800s, Pusey receives and encourages the first professed monastic vow since the Reformation, which was, in fact, a woman's monastic vow. And the founding of the beginnings of women's monasticism really can be traced to this intellectual movement of the Oxford movement. And in a lot of ways, the first woman to take the vows under Edward Pusey was a woman named Marian Hughes. And this is also about the founding of the first community of monastics within London, which takes part in 1845. I'm putting the word house here because monasticism is not just about a person living by themselves. Monasticism is about a vowed group of people living under certain kinds of vows, together in community, centered around the life of prayer and work. Again, largely, the types of monasticism that are going to be within the Church of England at this time, during the 1800s, are going to be based upon the, really, one of our earliest monastics within the Christian tradition, who has written an entire rule over it, which is the Benedictines, the rule of Saint Benedict. And Benedictine monasticism is probably the most obvious form of monasticism that permeates most of the church, because it is Really, it's one of the oldest orders. But the reason why I'm mentioning this is because when we have this particular sort of movement by the Oxford movement in this positive direction of monasticism, we then run into the problem of vows. I'm going to list three vows that we usually associate with monasticism. And these might be familiar. Poverty, chastity, and obedience. The vows of the traditional church are vows that situate the person who is taking on these monastic vows under these particular umbrellas. Again, different monastics are going to have different sort of flavors on that, but let's talk about them in turn. This is not something that's talked about in the chapter, but I think that this is an important note. Poverty. The concept of holding all things in common is something that is not only a part of the early monastic movement, but it's also biblical example. When we look in the Acts of the Apostles, the first believers in Jesus Christ, and likewise the first big corpus of believers who live during the time of St. Peter's Pentecost sermon, it says in the Acts of the Apostles that they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, the breaking of bread and the prayers, and that they held all things in common. And in a lot of ways, this community around Jesus, again, we're not talking about monasticism yet, but just in the Acts of the Apostles, the communities of the church were ones of kind of radical equanimity in which everybody pools their resources together and then uses those resources in order to both subsist upon and also to further the outreach of the gospel. Again, we see the calling of the first deacons can be a part of this. But that part of poverty is that I don't own anything myself, which is a big, big, big important thing for St. Benedict's rule. That it is important that everything is held in common for the common work of the community, not for an individual's private use, which you might be able to see why this was very countercultural, because we also live in a time in the 1800s of the Industrial Revolution, where all of a sudden all kinds of commodities are being made available by not simply just shipping and trade, but just things are simply being made more available in more quantities for more people to be able to purchase. And is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's hard to tell. But what it did do is arguably begin the first sort of like movement, or at least the first sort of like hinting towards a descent into materialism. Because that's really largely what we deal with in modern day, is an inundation of items that we can call our own for our own private use. The vow of poverty butts up against this idea of using your private property for your own private use, where those who are under the vow of poverty, in fact, do the opposite, that one acquiesces one's power over property or things in order to live a vowed monastic life in service of the community. Chastity. In the monastic vows, we are taking monastic vows of chastity. What that means is kind of obvious. We are living as a single person. We are not engaging in marital relations. and we are not married. Instead, we are married to Christ, or the brides of Christ, as these early revival movements in monasticism in England might talk about. This is another one that was deeply countercultural, because in many ways, and again, read Pride and Prejudice on this, okay? When we look at Victorian England, the kind of chief job of women during the time was to find husbands, work in the house, and bear children. And guess what? The vow of chastity in monasticism undercuts all of those things. It undercuts looking for a husband. In other words, marrying into a good family. And it completely takes that away. And in a lot of ways, the monastic houses become areas of freedom for women who might be caught up in that. And again, remember that in a lot of ways, the women were not the ones making the decision as to who to marry. They were attempting to curry the favor of someone that would then make a choice for them to marry someone. So in a lot of ways, they were being set free from that cultural moray in the monastic house. They were gaining freedom by becoming monastics. And again, that's not the only reason why they were doing so, but it also is a little bit of a perk of the job, if that makes sense. But again, chastity cuts under this idea of the woman's job is childbearing. And it says, in a theological way, no, that's not what a core identity of what it means to be a woman. And so these female communities were deeply suspicious to not just the religious community, but to the wider secular community. In fact, we see a number of different things being said or being written about these monastic communities in not so nice fashion. Some of them comedic, making fun of their funny dresses and stuff like that. But in a lot of ways, it was driven by this suspicion of what exactly were these women up to here? What's the ulterior motive of these women? They come to find out that the ulterior motive is to grow in the grace of Christ, which doesn't matter which age that you're in, that will always cause some problems for you. But obedience. Obedience to whom? Obedience is a deeply important part of the Benedictine monastic vow, because it drives home that we are being obedient to Christ and Christ's representatives. And in a lot of ways, the abbot or the amma, so the mother prioress or the male abbot who would be in charge of the monasteries, the men would be obedient to the abbot, the women would be obedient to the mother prioress. The vow of obedience is one that is, in fact, not simply in conflict with the kind of wider cultural assumptions about marriage, because obedience of the woman to her husband in marriage was a deep-seated sort of theological belief. And again, it's not that that's a bad thing. It's just that in the ways in which obedience works itself out, it was largely oppressive. We know that simply because of our records of the time. And it was largely one-sided. Largely, the men could do what they want, and the women could not. And so this engagement with obedience to the church, to Christ and Christ's representatives, made this Oxford movement and the people who follow the Oxford movement deeply counter-cultural in Victorian England. And so the vows in which they're under were actually, in a lot of ways, undercutting the very cultural zeitgeist of what the wider belief about who or what a woman was, which you could probably see why this was such an upsetting kind of movement. Weirdly enough, you could make some interesting parallels between the monastic movement that happens in the 1850s and the 1960s America, in the kind of wide sort of throwing off of certain quote-unquote traditional ways of doing things. We'll come to that in just a minute, though. But all I have to say is that the vows themselves were causing problems. The vows themselves, even though they were undertaken with great sincerity, made the first monastic houses quite odious to the rest of society, which is going to lead us into the growth and the decline of these monastic attempts. Because, as you probably can tell, within the Episcopal Church in the United States, it's simply not the case that we have a whole bunch of monastics running around the parish. Or do we? Because monastics are quite innovative. Monasticism is not just a dusty old idea. Monasticism, and this is a key thing for Peter Dunstan, who wrote this chapter, monasticism is innovative. That may seem like a conflict of terms, but the innovation in monasticism is one that he documents as to what kept these communities quite alive, because the monastics of the time fulfill certain kinds of roles, particularly outreach roles, that were simply not being fulfilled. And for all of us who live right now, we might have this idea in our heads that, oh, well, we've always had these kind of social work professions. The answer is no, we haven't. And very interestingly, the monastic movement in the Church of England in the 1850s is one of those movements that actually spurs this particular sort of social work movement that ends up actually being professionalized in the secular sphere rather than in the religious sphere. But it didn't always start that way. It was not always simply secular work. Because we can thank our Anglican monastics involving with the outreach were establishing orphanages, running medical schools, I should say medical schools and units. Running poorhouses. We might see some of these as particular kinds of professions. We might see orphanages and things like that as needing someone who is basically a human resources administrator. But that did not exist in the 1850s. Instead, we have monastics who began establishing these places. We had monastics, and in fact, this is probably the biggest contribution for monastics, which is the medical nursing field. It was almost ubiquitous. And this is a Roman Catholic and Anglican, I should mention, but it was almost ubiquitous within the 1800s to mid-1900s that you would have nuns who were full-time professionals in the nursing areas. And it would be completely normal to see nurses in their full habits running around hospitals taking care of patients. In fact, if you look at if you look at the uniforms of the nursing professions in the early 1900s, even those who were not vowed monastics, the nursing garb that, in fact, I'm thinking about one of our parishioners who was a nurse during the 1940s. Their nursing garb is very reminiscent of monastic habit. In fact, having little hats that looked very much like nurse headdresses that would be worn by the vowed monastics. So, but the running of medical schools and units was deeply important for the nuns' outreach ministry. Running poorhouses, poor outreach, providing food and shelter, things like that. In fact, Peter Dunstan notes that for as much as the nuns were made fun of for their funny garb and things like that, he said that really, and I like this little quote he has here. In our own church, it is most certain that since sisterhoods have been revived, the value of the work which they have done can hardly be overstated. They have earned a character for usefulness which we scarcely believe anyone, however opposed to them in principle, would venture to question. That, by the way, is noted by an 1878 Chronicle of Convocation published in one of the local newspapers. So, that being said, even though the sort of anti-Catholic bias, or even simply the wider social criticism of the work that these women were doing because of the vows of monasticism, the work that they were doing was, in a lot of ways, it was the shining example. It was proof that what they were doing was not frivolous in any way. And it was proof that what they were doing was deeply tied to their understanding of what we were supposed to do as church. And they were filling certain positions that were simply not only understaffed, but simply non-existent at the time. And in a lot of ways, it became so popular that these particular sorts of places of work, things that were being done, become adopted by the secular culture, adopted as not in the religious sense of being under vows, but in other words, the outreach that was happening was improving society from a sort of more kind of nuts and bolts perspective. But what was it doing? It was providing staffing for hospitals. It was taking care of people who needed to be taken care of. It was filling in gaps in the societal safety net for a number of people. And it was so popular that the Anglican monastics were gaining, in a lot of cases, they were gaining hundreds of adherents, which, again, further churns this cultural revolution that begins to happen. Because, again, we have the cultural norms of what a woman is running into a valorous understanding of what monastics are. And that change in cultural mind about what these strange people are doing running around in these funny clothes begins to actually gain adherents and grow monastic houses, particularly in the Benedictine and in the Franciscan roles. And obviously the Benedictine Franciscans have been a well-established order for a long time, but just to put it plainly, those are the orders that largely flourish during this time period. And so, in a lot of ways, the ways in which this revival happens is also pointing towards what we'll see as a decline in the history of monastic vows in the Anglican Church, because really of a lot of things that happen within the first part of the 1900s. Because we can't talk about monasticism without talking about the World Wars. And of course, the World Wars really encompass basically the beginning of the 1900s all the way through the 1950s. And so we are dealing with a world at war, to be put in that language. Peter Dunstan notes that the decline in the number of vocations to the religious life in Anglicans began during the First World War, 1914 to 1918. And even though some communities did grow, the decline begins in that particular area. And the numbers, in a lot of ways, being declining within the wider sort of religious sense really is due to the professionalization of some of these particular things. And so we see a movement away from a religious vowed monastic that is performing these duties to now we have again, a secularization of this outreach work. And again, this is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just the way that things happened. And when that happens, when you have the secularization of these types of outreach works into the more professional capacity, you simply have the ability for women to be able to take on these types of roles in a secular capacity. It's not merely a religious sort of activity, even though the work itself, we could argue, is quite religious. But it's not merely centered upon the monastics in doing these work anymore. Now it is a renewed sort of push in the kind of social aspect from really, in a lot of ways, the kind of shove that the monastics gave to wider culture. But one of the things that we also need to pay attention to during this time is this funny paradox that happens in that, I'm going to put this in scare quotes here, old-fashioned. Every movement that goes on in the world eventually runs out of steam, and it eventually becomes old hat. The Anglican monastics, as innovative as they were in the 1800s, by the time that we get to the world wars, were deemed to be old-fashioned, old ways of doing things, old and dusty, like a lot of us probably think of monastics when we think about the ancient traditions of the church. The thing that begins to happen is that we have an assumption that, okay, all of these people running around in funny clothes look very outlandish and perhaps out of fashion. Now again, there's all kinds of criticism we can levy at that, but all that is to say is that the culture went from suspicion of the Anglican orders based upon their sort of undercutting of the common cultural vows, or, cultural vows is probably a good way to put it, the common cultural norms. In other words, the monastic vows that were so deeply undercutting and countercultural, now because the outreach of those particular units had become so popular, they became kind of subsumed into a sort of like cultural normalcy. And when that happened, now when we get to the world wars and we have a fairly established or an establishment sort of experience, an establishment sort of picture of the monastics, now we all of a sudden run into the fact that, oh, that's nothing that's interesting on the one sense, but it's also like it's establishment. It's simply become a part of the way that we do things. And so why undergo this religious sort of vow when you can simply just take a job doing this? Which practically, there's, again, nothing wrong with that. As Peter notes, that even though we're talking about the history of vows, we need to talk about the fact that certain people are called to certain kinds of ministry, and certain people are not called to certain kinds of ministry. And so the muddying of the waters when it comes to the outreach activities is one that is important for us to note. And so we have a decline in monasticism as we go into the 1900s. But one of the things that we also need to pay attention to is the innovative ways in which monastics can operate. We need to talk about the post-World War time. Because our monastics are quite flexible, particularly, and like I said earlier, particularly the Benedictines and the Franciscans. Because we had a rise in not monastic professions, but a third way, which we're going to call the rise of tertiaries. Tertiaries, I'll call them terts for short. Tertiaries are non-monastic people who nonetheless live in obedience alongside monastic communities. These become very important because in the 1960s, you may be aware that there is a big important thing that happens in the 1960s, not simply culturally in the U.S., but there is the meeting of the Second Vatican Council. The Second Vatican Council saw on the Roman Catholic side a decline in monastic vows. And they are looking at ways in which to reinvigorate monastic vows and monastic life. One of the ways in which the desire to be under vows can be fulfilled is not by necessarily asking people to become monks and nuns just by kind of blank check, so to speak. Instead, offering the vows of the monastics to be intertwined with the role of the local parish. And not simply that, but to be intertwined with the lives of local families. This is where tertiaries come in. People who deeply connect with the monastic life, but are not called in the same sorts of way that vowed monastics are called. Tertiaries uphold many of the same values that the monastics themselves uphold. And these tertiaries are communities of people that are under, really, in a lot of ways, vows themselves, but live in a non-monastic capacity. There is, by the way, a fantastic example of this that goes on, and these are not necessarily tertiaries, this is a community of people, but really, in a lot of ways, the Order of the Daughters of the King within the Episcopal Church of the United States is, I think, a good example of this type of new monasticism, which is what in the 1990s, this is what these kinds of movements were kind of being couched as, the new monasticism. In a lot of ways, monasticism, the roles of vows in monasticism and likewise the importance of monasticism didn't change. It's just that monasticism is innovative. Monastics are very good about being able to serve in the way that Jesus is calling them to, holding to the traditional structures of being under vows, but also being able to move with the needs of the communities surrounding them at the time that it is proper to do so, and in large part at the encouragement of the larger church in general, such as Vatican Council, the Second Vatican Council, that also has a lot to offer us in the Anglican tradition as well. But monasticism is innovative. It is something that just as the Spirit moves us places where we might not anticipate, so also monasticism itself, through the history of the past 150 years in the Anglican Church, has needed to be so. And in a lot of ways, this new rise of tertiaries, once again, is undercutting certain cultural mores that are, in a lot of ways, being challenged, probably for good reason. Because remember how I talked about materialism, the rise of materialism in the Industrial Revolution, and that conflict between private use of our own stuff versus the vow of poverty? That is one of the biggest drivers of some of the new monastic callings that we have been seeing in the Episcopal Church, has been this, and it's been largely by the younger generations. There has been a quite impressive amount of the younger generation who, in a lot of ways, are rejecting this kind of rampant materialism that is so inundating our culture. And you can actually see that in the examples very recently of personalities who used to be big on YouTube and Twitch that have, in fact, gone away from engaging in that online capacity and have actually created communities that are much smaller and are much more, let's say, devoted to this idea of shared life. In the secular capacity, it's fascinating to watch this happen because it highlights what this book is trying to get at. There is a deep longing for vows, for intentionality, for community, that a lot of the surrounding culture is in a lot of ways pulling apart. I think, again, it's one of those things where I don't want to speak too soon about this, but I think we might have already gone past the peak of social media, at least the ways in which it currently exists, because so much more awareness has been drawn to the fact that social media so often segments and divides people from their own physical communities, and that people live in these sort of illusory online places that don't have any real substance to them, instead of engaging with the real flesh and blood and dirt substance of their communities in which they actually live in. And there's been a recent beginnings of a rejection of that I think is good. I think is actually good. But the monastics and the vows that they're under, the 1850s vowed monastics in Anglicanism might have a lot more to do with our lives today than we might actually think. And in that way, Peta concludes the chapter by saying that this is, in fact, where we have to start the question. This is where we have to start the question. The last couple of paragraphs of this chapter read, "It is the task of the rest of this book to unfold the relationships of all the vows in the church to the primary vows of baptism, and then reflect afresh on how religious vows especially sharpen the significance of those in contemporary culture. But there are pinch points in which we are running into conflict and running into, again, culture versus religious observance. And we have to unwind those things carefully before we can get to where we want to get to as it comes to the re-examination of vows within the life of the church." So where does that leave us? Well, that leaves us with a couple of interesting outcomes to the history of the monastics within the Anglican tradition. The outcomes in a lot of ways, are driven by a rediscovery of ancient practice. Just in the largest sort of way that we can kind of describe it, monasticism is one of the most ancient movements in church history. That is simply a matter of historical fact. And the monastic movement in the early parts of the church's history was a counter-cultural movement. It was criticizing the vapid acceptance of Roman life that integrates into church life. And again, it's not that there are not good things that come about from those things. It's just that the unexamined melding of church and culture can often yield more culture than church, if that makes sense. It can dilute a lot of what the core charisms or the core principles of those movements are until they largely become establishment entities. This, by the way, is one of the chief criticisms of the Reformation on the Roman Catholic Church, which the Roman Catholic Church, in fact, if you read in the 1400s documents, the Roman Catholic Church was extremely aware that it needed reformation. They knew that they needed reform, and particularly, they knew that the monastic orders needed reform. And guess where the chief stars of the Reformation come from? They are former monastics. Luther was a former Augustinian monk. Calvin, former Augustinian monk. So we can go down the line of real people who were a part of these monastic movements in the Reformation, criticizing the need of the wider church for Reformation because the culture has so enveloped the practice of the church that you no longer can actually see the connective tissue between the Benedictines of the 300s and the Benedictines of the 1500s. So, monastics are innovative. We have to rediscover what exactly we're being called to be, in the monastic sense, based upon where we find ourselves historically. And so the history of the monastic movement within the Anglican Church, as Peter Dunstan notes in this chapter, has everything to do with our attitudes towards what vows look like. And I think in kind of a sneaky way, he highlights one of the things that vows does, which is that vows bind you to a certain way of life. And that way of life is not uncontroversial. That way of life that you're being bound to is one that will make people look at you differently. And it will have exterior evidence of the things that you are vowing to. You cannot make a vow in the church, baptism or otherwise, without that fundamentally changing who you are. And I think that's the crux of where we're starting. Because next week, we're going to talk about baptism. And baptism, by its very nature, is that thing that transforms us from what we were before into what we are now. To use St. Paul's language, the old has passed away, the new has come. Or just in baptism, we are buried in a death like Christ that we may be raised in a resurrection like his. There is a fundamental transformation of ourselves, spiritually, physically, all the package that comes with the vows of baptism. So that being said, next week we're going to deal with baptismal vows and what the baptismal vow in the church really means for us in the widest sense possible, remembering that when we go under vows, we are, in a lot of cases, gaining freedom rather than losing it. That particular point will be elucidated in, I think, a fascinating way next week when we deal with baptism.